The morning the Allies landed on Normandy, the sky was thick with smoke, the air filled with the thunder of war. The horizon burned with the fire of naval bombardments. The beaches churned under relentless machine gun fire, and the sea turned dark as waves of soldiers stormed the shore. From our defensive positions, we watched the unfolding battle with a sinking realization. This was not just another attack. This was the beginning of the end. The might of the Allied forces had come crashing down, and for the first time, we sensed something we had never felt before: defeat. The ground shook beneath us before we even saw them. The bombardment had begun long before the first landing craft touched the shore, an unrelenting storm of destruction raining down from the sea. The air was thick with smoke, a suffocating cloud that filled every trench, every bunker, and every corridor of our defenses. The deafening roar of explosions drowned out all thought, and the sheer force of the shelling sent tremors through the very ground we stood on. This was no ordinary attack. This was something else entirely. The bunkers groaned under the impact, concrete walls cracking, metal shattering as artillery rounds struck with merciless precision. The men around me gritted their teeth, their hands gripping weapons, waiting for the inevitable. Orders came through broken radios, voices strained and barely audible over the relentless pounding from offshore. Hold the line. Hold the position. Do not let them through. But as the earth trembled, as fire and steel rained down, we began to wonder how anyone could hold against this. Through the narrow slits of the bunkers, we caught glimpses of the carnage outside. The landscape that had once been fortified, lined with obstacles and trenches, was now a wasteland of shattered debris. Barbed wire was torn apart, anti-tank defenses reduced to twisted metal. Our gun emplacements, once positioned with careful calculation, were now buried under mounds of rubble. The defensive positions we had spent months preparing were being obliterated before they even faced a direct assault. Some men muttered to themselves, prayers whispered under their breath. Others sat in silence, their expressions hardened, knowing that soon they would be facing an enemy they had never seen in such numbers. The idea of an invasion had always been distant, a looming possibility that, until this moment, had never seemed real. But now, as the bombardment intensified, as the sky burned with fire and smoke, reality set in. The Allies had come, and they had come with a force greater than anything we had imagined. When the shelling finally eased, replaced by the rhythmic droning of engines, we knew what was coming next. We peered through the haze, through the dust and smoke, and there they were, hundreds of landing craft cutting through the waves, carrying an army unlike anything we had ever seen. Row upon row of them, packed with soldiers, weapons, and machinery, all moving toward us with terrifying inevitability. Machine guns were manned, artillery adjusted, orders shouted. We knew our positions, we knew the plans, but nothing in our training had prepared us for the sheer scale of what was coming. The first boats reached the shore, their ramps lowering as soldiers poured out. We opened fire immediately, the sounds of gunfire merging with the crashing of the waves. Some of them fell before they could even step onto the sand, their bodies collapsing into the water, dragged away by the tide. But they did not stop. More boats arrived, more men surged forward. Our bullets tore through their ranks, but they kept advancing. The sheer number of them was staggering, an unrelenting tide that could not be held back. They ran through gunfire, through exploding mortar rounds, through the bodies of their fallen. Their determination was something I had never witnessed before. No matter how many were cut down, more came to take their place. The first wave struggled against the obstacles we had laid out, fighting through the barbed wire, the mines, the barricades meant to slow them. But they moved with terrifying efficiency. Engineers, under constant fire, worked quickly to clear paths for those behind them. Tanks rolled off landing craft, their armor glinting in the dim light, their cannons roaring to life as they targeted our remaining strongholds. The battle had become something else entirely. We had always believed in the strength of our defenses, in the precision of our weapons, in the discipline of our training. But nothing prepared us for this. The relentless pressure of an enemy who would not break, would not stop, would not surrender. They advanced through fire, through steel, through everything we threw at them. The radio crackled again, commands from officers desperate to regain control, voices strained and urgent. Reinforcements were called for, but we knew there were none. The enemy had come in such overwhelming numbers that our forces were stretched thin, isolated pockets of resistance, fighting to hold back a flood. More explosions rocked the ground. A direct hit tore through a bunker down the line, sending debris flying. The men inside never had a chance. A tank shell struck an artillery position, silencing one of our few remaining defensive guns. The beach was no longer a defensive line. It had become a slaughterhouse, and we were the ones being cut down. As the battle raged on, the sight before us became clearer. Our defenses were crumbling. The machine gun nests that had been our strongest assets were being overrun. The trenches, once thought to be secure, were now filled with the bodies of our own men. The bunkers, our last refuge, were being systematically destroyed. The realization sank in, cold and undeniable. This was not just another battle. This was something greater, something that could not be stopped. The enemy was breaking through, and there was nothing we could do to prevent it. Normandy was falling, and with it, so were we. The beach was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. The bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the sand, some half-buried in the churned-up earth, others motionless in the shallows, where the tide lapped against their uniforms. Smoke clung to the wreckage of landing craft that had been torn apart by gunfire and artillery, their twisted metal frames jutting from the surf like skeletal remains. The defenses that had once seemed unshakable were now buckling under the sheer force of the invasion. We had fired until our barrels overheated, reloaded until there was nothing left to load, but it made no difference. No matter how many fell, more took their place. The waves of men did not stop, did not hesitate. They crawled forward through the carnage, through the burning wreckage, through the bodies of their comrades. We had never seen anything like it before. This was not a simple attack. It was a force beyond anything we had imagined. Inside the bunkers, the air was thick with sweat and gunpowder. The walls trembled with every explosion, concrete cracking, dust falling from the ceilings as artillery shells pounded the ground above. Orders came through in frantic bursts over the radio, voices strained, some cutting out mid-sentence. We were losing ground faster than anyone had expected, our positions collapsing under the unrelenting assault. The plan had been to hold, to make the enemy pay for every inch, but the reality was far worse than any scenario we had prepared for. Machine gunners continued to fire from the cliffs, the rhythmic bursts of their weapons cutting through the chaos. Yet even with the advantage of elevation, it was not enough. The enemy adapted, adjusted, found cover, and kept advancing. Grenades were hurled up toward our positions, explosions sending men flying, their weapons torn from their hands. Each impact shook the very ground, each detonation another step toward our defeat. A tank shell struck a nearby bunker, the force of the explosion sending a shockwave through the trenches. The structure groaned, its walls splitting apart before collapsing in a cloud of dust and smoke. The men inside were gone before they even knew what hit them. Those who had survived in neighboring positions knew what would come next. The enemy was breaching, moving through the gaps, pouring into the spaces where our defenses had been wiped away. Out in the open fields beyond the beach, more of them were pushing inland. Some had already reached the first hills, the terrain giving them cover as they regrouped, planned their next moves. From where we were, we could see their tanks rolling forward, their movements methodical, calculated. They were no longer fighting to survive the landing. They were fighting to seize control. Everywhere we looked, our positions were failing. The men who had stood with confidence only hours before now scrambled to hold whatever ground they could. Some fired until their ammunition was gone, then fought with whatever they had left. A few clutched their rifles like lifelines, their fingers numb, their bodies rigid with the realization that escape was no longer an option. More explosions. Another bunker lost. More trenches overrun. The defensive line that had once stood as an impenetrable barrier was now nothing more than scattered strongpoints, barely holding together. The radio crackled again, retreat orders, fragmented, uncertain. Some units had already begun to fall back. Others had been cut off entirely, their fate unknown. The officers tried to regain control, but there was no controlling what was happening. The enemy was too strong, too determined. Some of us knew we had only minutes left before we were completely surrounded. There were no reinforcements coming, no miracle that would turn the tide. Normandy was slipping from our grasp, and with it, any illusion that we could hold this ground. The battle had already been decided. The only question left was how long we could last before it was over. I gripped my weapon tighter, watching as more of them climbed the cliffs, moved through the trenches, took control of the fields beyond. The tide had come in, and it had washed everything away. The beach belonged to them now. Soon, the rest of France would too. The world outside the bunkers had changed. What had once been a battlefield held by strong defenses was now a chaotic ruin where order had vanished. The air was filled with smoke so thick it obscured the horizon, turning everything into a haze of fire and destruction. Gunfire and explosions still raged across the landscape, but the rhythm of battle had shifted. The enemy was no longer just storming the beaches. They had broken through, spreading like a flood, dismantling what remained of our lines. From our positions, we could see them moving through the wreckage, pressing forward with relentless precision. The trenches that had once held firm were now overrun. The bunkers that had provided protection were either collapsing from direct hits or being cleared out one by one. Grenades were tossed into openings, filling once secure strongholds with fire and shrapnel. Every defensive structure that had been a source of confidence before the invasion had now become a death trap, and those still inside knew they had little time left. We had expected the assault to be brutal, but not like this. The enemy adapted quickly, moving through the landscape with an efficiency that was terrifying to witness. They advanced in coordinated squads, covering one another as they pushed inland. Engineers worked quickly to clear paths for vehicles, removing obstacles that had once been our best hope of slowing them down. The artillery behind them never ceased, pounding anything that still offered resistance. Radio transmissions were breaking apart, filled with shouts, static, and desperation. Officers called for counterattacks, but there were no longer enough men to launch them. Reinforcements were requested, but there were none left to send. What had started as a battle to defend an impenetrable line had now become a desperate attempt to survive a war that had already been lost. Soldiers who had once stood with unwavering resolve were now falling back, searching for new cover, but there was nowhere left to go. Some fired until their weapons were empty. Others fought with bayonets, knowing surrender was not an option. A few ran, retreating into what remained of the fields behind us, hoping to find another defensive position. They would not find one. The enemy was advancing too quickly, overwhelming everything in their path. A group of us remained near the last functioning machine gun nest, holding out as long as possible. The gunner fired in bursts, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, his hands trembling as he fed the last belt of ammunition into the weapon. He knew, as we all did, that this was only delaying the inevitable. The enemy had already moved beyond us, flanking from the sides, cutting off escape routes, ensuring that there was no way out. A deafening explosion ripped through the air as another bunker was destroyed, sending debris flying. The ground shook with the impact, and the sky filled with dust. The last officer still standing gave hurried orders: pull back if possible, regroup if there was still time. But there was no time. The battle had collapsed into chaos. The few still holding their ground fought until the last moment, but one by one, the positions fell silent. Some were taken prisoner, dragged from the rubble by soldiers who had no time to waste. Others vanished in the smoke, their fate unknown. The only certainty was that we had lost. By late afternoon, the fields beyond the beach belonged to them. The sound of marching boots replaced the gunfire, the sight of enemy flags rising over the ruins marking the end of the fight. We had stood against the storm, but the storm had been too strong. The Allies had landed, and nothing had stopped them. As I looked across the shattered landscape, I understood what had happened. Normandy had fallen. The war was changing, and for us, there would be no turning it back. The weight of that truth settled over everything, heavier than any weapon, more final than any order. The invasion had succeeded, and the road to our defeat had begun. The battlefield no longer belonged to us. The sounds of gunfire had faded, replaced by the steady movement of troops advancing deeper into the countryside. Smoke still lingered over the coastline, rising from burning wreckage, drifting over the bodies left behind. What had once been an impenetrable defense had crumbled in a matter of hours. The men who had fought to hold this ground were now either dead, captured, or in retreat, scattered across a landscape that had already been lost. The realization settled in like a weight too heavy to bear. What we had spent years building, the bunkers, the trenches, the carefully planned defenses, had fallen apart against the sheer force of an invasion too vast to stop. The enemy had not only taken the beaches, they had swept through the fortifications, pushed beyond the coastal defenses, and now they were expanding their control further inland. This was no temporary foothold. They had come to stay. I moved through the wreckage, my uniform torn, my weapon feeling heavier with every step. The world around me was unrecognizable. The positions where I had once stood with confidence, believing they could withstand anything, were now reduced to rubble. I saw the remains of our fortifications, some barely standing, others completely obliterated by the relentless bombardment. The machine gun nests that had fired until their barrels melted were now silent, their crews lying where they had fallen. Some of our men had tried to escape through the hills, hoping to regroup with whatever forces still remained. Others had simply surrendered, their hands raised as they were led away under armed guard. The defeat was complete, undeniable. There was no rallying point, no counteroffensive. There was only the grim march away from the battlefield, leaving behind everything we had once believed to be unshakable. The enemy moved with efficiency, securing the ground they had fought so hard to take. Engineers worked quickly to clear roads, marking paths for the reinforcements that would soon arrive in greater numbers. Tanks rolled inland, pushing deeper into territory that had once been ours. The beaches, now secured, were filling with supplies, fresh troops pouring in, their presence ensuring that this invasion was only the beginning. For those of us who remained, there was no choice but to keep moving. Captured soldiers walked in long columns, their faces hollow, their eyes fixed on the ground. There was no defiance left, only the exhaustion of those who had given everything in a battle that could not be won. As we were led away, I glanced back one last time. The shore was littered with debris, twisted metal, shattered vehicles, the remains of men who had fought on both sides. The sea lapped at the edge of the battlefield, indifferent to the destruction it had witnessed. The bunkers, the defenses, the carefully laid plans, all of it had been erased in a single day. The enemy had done what we had thought impossible. They had landed, they had fought, and they had won. The war was not over, but for us, for those who had tried to hold Normandy, it was finished. The tide had turned, and nothing would stop it now. The road ahead, wherever it led, would be walked under the shadow of defeat. The invasion had succeeded, and with it, the fate of the war had been decided. The march away from the battlefield felt heavier with every step. The distant echoes of gunfire had faded into an eerie silence, replaced by the steady rhythm of boots against dirt, the occasional crackle of radios, and the low murmur of voices giving quiet orders. The air still carried the bitter scent of gunpowder and burning wreckage, lingering like a ghost over the shattered landscape. The beach, once fortified and guarded with the belief that it could never fall, was now firmly in the hands of those we had failed to stop. The men around me walked in silence, their faces drawn, their eyes vacant. Some limped, their wounds hastily bandaged, their uniforms torn and stained. Others simply stared ahead, too exhausted to think, too drained to feel anything beyond the weight of the moment. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered. We had believed in the strength of our defenses, in the impenetrability of the Atlantic wall, but the truth had been laid bare. Nothing we had built had withstood the force that had come against it. The road inland was littered with the remnants of battle. Wrecked vehicles smoldered on the roadside, their metal twisted from explosions, their crews lying motionless nearby. Discarded weapons and empty ammunition crates were scattered across the fields, abandoned in the chaos of retreat. Some soldiers, those who had resisted until the very end, had been left where they fell, their hands still clutching their rifles, their expressions frozen in the final moments of their fight. Among the prisoners, no one spoke. There was no need. We all understood what had happened. Normandy was gone. The war had shifted, and with it, the fate of everything we had fought for. The enemy had proven unstoppable, their numbers overwhelming, their determination unbreakable. They had done what we had believed impossible, tearing through our defenses, pushing us back with a force that could not be denied. The columns moved forward, winding through roads that had once been ours, past villages that would soon fall under new control. The enemy had no reason to stop now. Their ships continued to unload more soldiers, more tanks, more artillery. Reinforcements poured in from the beaches, their organization precise, their advance methodical. They had taken Normandy, but they would not stop there. They would push deeper, claiming town after town, road after road, until nothing remained beyond their reach. As we passed through the ruins of a once secure outpost, I caught a glimpse of the enemy soldiers securing the area. They moved with purpose, their uniforms covered in dust and sweat, their weapons slung across their backs. They did not look like conquerors. They looked like men who had survived something unimaginable, men who had fought through hell and come out the other side. They had not won because of luck. They had won because nothing could have stopped them. The realization settled in like a cold weight in my chest. This was not just a fall of a single stronghold. This was the beginning of the end. The world as we had known it was crumbling, and we had witnessed the moment it began to collapse. No amount of preparation, no years of fortifications, no deeply held belief in our strength had been enough to stop what had unfolded before us. The enemy had come, and they had not just taken the beaches, they had taken everything. The night fell over the road, casting long shadows over the weary figures trudging forward. The sound of distant engines and the low hum of conversations between guards filled the silence, but nothing could erase the truth that loomed over us. The war would continue, but for us, for those who had stood on the shores of Normandy and watched the tide turn, it had already ended. I looked ahead, knowing there was no return to what had been before. The enemy had landed, and nothing would be the same again. The fate of everything had shifted in the span of a single day, and all that remained was the long march forward into the unknown, carrying the weight of defeat that could never be undone.